and orcs in the deep places of the world.
Everything out of the ordinary is to be reported.
Fiery the angels fell. Deep thunder rolled around their shores.
It may just be my imagination. Whatever it is that's watching, it's not human.
We are all now programmed for perfect happiness. Perfect happiness. Perfect happiness. Perfect happiness.
Quite an experience to live in fear, isn't it? That's what it is to be a slave.
It's a hard world for little things.
What we do in life echoes in eternity.
You know, there was a time in this country when smart people were considered cool. Well, maybe not cool, but smart people did things like build ships and pyramids, and they even went to the moon.
The Great Conjunction is the end of the world! Oh, the beginning?
It was a church. Do you know that word? Yes, there were still churches when I was a child.
But all things that are exposed are made manifest by the light. For whatever makes manifest is light.
You now belong to God, no longer to the devil.
What you said just now is quite extraordinary.
You're listening to Beyond Extraordinary with Natalie.
It is a balmy 2 degrees above zero here in the Red River Valley. And so my seemingly unending theme of talking about how cold it is continues. Although 2 degrees above zero is actually much warmer. You know, you live in North Dakota when 2 degrees above zero can ever be referred to as warmer than anything else. But actually, yesterday we registered a negative 12 wind chill. So the weather, the polar vortex, whatever you want to call. You know, here's the thing. First of all, let me just say, welcome to Beyond Extraordinary. This is Natalina, as always. So glad you're here. So I think meteorologists at this point are just making stuff up. Like, had you ever heard of a polar vortex previous to a couple of years ago or last winter? I hadn't, and I live in the coldest, statistically coldest place in the United States of America. There's a list just came out. The city where I live was number 1 on the list of the coldest places in the United States. So I think if there ever previously was such a thing as a polar vortex, I would have heard about it. But I think the very first time I heard it was last winter. It's this new term that they came up with. And so a few weeks ago, Michio Kaku, if those of you out there have ever heard of him, I'm a big fan of Michio Kaku, although I think that as time has gone on, he's become a lot more sort of beholden to this progressive, sort of global warming cabal, but I still think he's fantastic. I think he's super smart. I like big brains, but regardless, he came forward saying that we were in the bullseye of all hell was about to break loose because this thing, which is similar to a polar vortex, but not really a polar vortex, was about to happen. And he said there was a word for it called bombogenesis.
Now, remember the polar vortex of last year?
Yes.
This is called bombogenesis.
Like, now you're really reaching. Bombogenesis. How about we do what we used to do and just blame the Canadians and get on with our lives, right? I mean, it's a cold snap. It's an Arctic chill. It's, it's an Alberta clipper. That's what we call them around here. This just cold air coming in and making everybody cold. It's called winter. Okay, we don't have to come up with these crazy new terms for it that make it sound all the more frightening. Ooh, it's a polar vortex is on the way, and look out for the bombogenesis. Like, what is that? It's cold. It's winter. Let's just be realistic. So, okay, but, maybe it's colder than usual. Maybe it's, I guess I don't have a really good barometer for saying that, because it's always cold here around this time of year. And, that's just life where I'm from. So enough of that. How many of you had an opportunity to check out the Prophecy Forum conference this past weekend? I was at home live streaming it, and it was so good. I mean, it was just so, the speakers all did an excellent job. Some of them my friends, so I was rooting for them, but really everybody, even the folks I had never heard speak before, just everybody did such a good job, and it was just, the content was fantastic. But beyond the content, just the structure of the conference was so good, and it was hard to believe that this was the first thing that these 5 guys had done together. It was Doug Woodward, Gons Shimura, John Haller, Gary Winkleman, and Doug Krieger, and they pulled off this incredibly professional and just really good conference. And the conference itself had such a high production value. It had fantastic artwork. It had great videos. It had great audio stream. The live stream was fantastic. It was all just so good. So I think that it bodes well for the future of the Prophecy Forum. Let's keep them in our prayers, because they really did a great job. But I know all of them now are probably super stressed and decompressing from, we see these kinds of things happen, but, in all honesty, it takes a lot to put something like that together, and they've been working on it for, months. And especially this last several weeks where it's really been crunch time, poor Gons, he just ran himself ragged. So I don't even know if he's woken up from his post-conference nap. He did such an incredible job. So hats off to Gons, and hats off to everybody who made that conference happen. That's at theprophecyforum.com if you want to check out and see when they're going to make a DVD available of all of the speakers, including the ones who are not part of the live stream. So I'm really looking forward to that, and I will bring you more information as soon as that comes about. So all of that said, thanks as usual for tuning in to the show today. I've got a really good one for you today. My guest is Brian Godawa, and I had heard interviews with Brian previously. I had always been familiar with his work, but I had never taken the time to actually read his books and research what he was into in any sort of in-depth way. I was pleasantly surprised once I actually set aside the time to dig into it by just how wonderful his work is through his Chronicles of the Nephilim. My goodness, there's just endless intrigue and scholarship and imaginative realms, and it's so good. So we're going to talk to Brian Godawa about all of that. We're going to hear about how he came to be interested in this subject matter. We're going to learn a little bit about his background. It was a great conversation, and I am such a fan of this guy. We're already going to have him on again because his sort of realm of expertise is quite vast. So this show, we focused largely on his upcoming, or actually his book that's out now, and his previous works in the Chronicles of the Nephilim. And then in our next show, we're going to talk more about his work in Hollywood and Hollywood worldviews and that type of thing. So that'll be coming in a part 2, probably sometime in December. But thank you all so very much for tuning into the show today. I think I said that already. At this point, I'm rambling, so I should just get into the interview. And I'm appreciative of those of you who have gone to the website extraordinaryintelligence.com and taken the time to send me your emails, to follow me on Twitter, to follow me on Pinterest, to join my Facebook group, to subscribe to the site, and especially those who have clicked the support tab and given their generous gifts to what it is that I'm doing with the site and with the podcast and all of that. You are a fantastic audience and you're growing with every episode. I am so blessed. My cup runneth over. You guys make me love what I do, and guests like Brian Godawa make me love what I do, and we do it all for his glory, right? Not Brian Godawa's glory, although he's really fantastic, but we do it for the Lord here at Beyond Extraordinary and ExtraordinaryIntelligence.com. And without any further ado, let's get into it, shall we?
In the primeval history of Genesis, an ancient war began between the seed of the serpent and the seed of Eve. Fallen angels called Watchers begot a race of giants called Nephilim, their goal to stop the bloodline of the promised seed. But God had other plans. Chronicles of the Nephilim is a biblical fantasy series of novels that charts the rise and fall of the Watchers and the giants in the stories of the Bible and in between. Read all 8 novels, from Noah Primeval all the way to Jesus Triumphant. Available on Kindle and paperback at Amazon.com. Go to chroniclesofthenephilim.com and enter a world of ancient history and biblical imagination. That's chroniclesofthenephilim.com.
I'm really excited because I'm bringing someone new onto the show today, and many of you have probably heard of him if you are fans of View from the Bunker with Derek Gilbert and some of the other shows in this genre. But if you don't know who Brian Godawa is, let me just tell you, his career is one that spans from one art form to another. As a graphic designer, award-winning screenwriter, author, speaker, he has all the well-rounded background and skill set that I think it's safe to say has earned him the title of Renaissance Man. Today, Brian has joined me to discuss his Nephilim Chronicles series of books, and specifically his latest in the series, David Ascendant. So I'm really, really excited to bring Brian Godawa onto the show today. Brian, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Natalina.
This is really cool because I have heard interviews with you in the past, and I have heard about your books, and I find myself on this massive time crunch where it's so hard for me to actually just sit down and enjoy a book, which is unfortunate and probably largely my fault, because we should all just kick back and take a little time for ourselves every once in a while. But so I hadn't gotten around to actually reading what you had written, but I was intrigued by what you were writing about. And finally, I have found the opportunity to really get into your material. And Brian, I just have to say, it's magnificent. It is so inspiring and imaginative, and so, you know, there's an academic aspect to it that's so incredible. I'm just so impressed by not only your writing, but your research and what you have been able to put out with the Chronicles of the Nephilim. So I'm overflowing with things I want to hear you talk about. But before I get into it, one thing that I like to do on my show is just ask people outside of, you know, your resume specifically. I'm interested always in knowing about people's background of their faith. And I was just wondering if it would be okay if I ask you a little bit about that story. Have you always been a Christian? Is it something that came later in life?
Oh, well, I'd be glad to talk about that, actually. I love that because God is, you know, the heart of my life. So, no, you know, I was actually born and raised in a Roman Catholic household, but my parents were not very, they weren't religious. They just sort of went just because it was how they were raised and all that, and they didn't really believe. So I wasn't really taught much about God until I was later in high school, and I went to this youth group at this little church just starting out called Willow Creek Community Church with Bill Hybels. That's a pretty famous church now, but when I started there, they were just starting out, and they had this youth ministry going on, and I went there, and it explained the gospel of Jesus Christ to me in a way that was very relevant to me. It was very artistic because they played rock music, they did drama skits, and all this stuff that I never got in the traditional church background. And it opened me up to understanding that, God is not just a religion. There's a relationship element. And not only that, but it was through a relationship, through someone taking an interest in me, loving me, giving me time, and explaining God as best he understood it. That explained to me that I came to realize that I was separated from God, this sense of alienation that I felt in my own life of if there's a God, how come I don't feel him? Where is he? It's like you don't really have a sense that he's there too much. And I realized that feeling was an alienation that was caused by my sin. And I was basically a really good person. By most worldly standards, I didn't take drugs. I didn't even drink or smoke. I didn't want to, and so I really didn't, do these bad sins or anything like that. But I broke all of God's commandments in my heart, and if not outwardly, and so I realized that the inner sense, as C.S. Lewis talks about, pride is the ultimate sin, and so that I had all too well, and I realized that I needed to be forgiven of my sins and, brought back into a relationship with God, and Jesus Christ, his death on the cross, secured that salvation for me. And by believing in him, putting my faith in him and following him, I entered into a relationship with God. I was about 17 years old, and so it's been quite a few years ago. But at that time, I've never been I'm a passionate person. I'm an artist, and so I think in those terms, and I've got a lot of feelings and passions in many ways, but, I never really had my spiritual life was not very emotional. In many ways, I've been cerebral, and I've sort of started out as a non-denominational Christian, but as the years went on, I because of my interest in philosophy and in the arts, I studied and read Francis Schaeffer and the Labrie guys, H.R. Rootmacher, and that helped me understand that my Christian faith, which at the time, and I think it's still a problem with some churches, though it's getting better, and that was I had a hard time making my art fit in with my faith, and people in church didn't understand artists, and so Francis Schaeffer's work helped me to understand the nature of worldviews, and I became interested in philosophy, and then through that into apologetics. And so for many years, I've been an apologetics fiend, and but over the years, that created an imbalance, actually, to be honest with you. I think I kind of worshipped reason as a deity, as a god, almost, as a kind of idolatrous in terms of just sort of reducing my faith to a cerebral, intellectual thing. And of course, God is, let us reason together and all that. And so I believe that God is, God is at the heart of reason and logic, to be sure. But that's not all that he is, and that's not all we are as human beings. And so even though I had remained an artist, I sort of lived a separated life in my faith where, my faith was more intellectual, more academic, and, like I said, I studied theology and all that kind of stuff. But my art was more passionate, story-oriented. But I think in more recent years, I started to sort of see that the limits of reason, much like C.S. Lewis had his, sort of negative experience in realizing that, my reason can't figure everything out. God's beyond it, and I have to embrace that sense of mystery and also embrace the storied nature of God's truth and theology, and sort of coming. Basically, what happened was I started looking more deeply into the ancient Near Eastern background of the Bible, the story, how they told stories back then, how the ancient mind thought. And I started learning how much my own modern Western mind had imposed on my reading of the Bible, the plain reading of the text. But what happened was, and this is all coming into what we're going to talk about, but it helped me to explore the poetry of the Bible, the storytelling of the Bible, and it brought me into a place where I feel like I was now more integrating my faith and my imagination with my reason, rather than just sort of have a reason-oriented faith and then my art and imagination was on the outside. And that exploration was what started to open the door to me understanding the Bible and pursuing my understanding of the Bible through the eyes of the original readers and writers. And of course, in order to do that, you can't just read the text. You got to study. You got to learn more about it. And that's when the doorway started open. That was when I read John Walton's material. And I can't think of the name of the book, but it's something about like the Hebrew, I can't remember the title of it, sorry about that, but John Walton's a Christian theologian who writes on that, and he's written a book about Genesis 1 and cosmology and such. Anyway, when I started doing that, I started seeing, and appreciating more the imagination of the Bible. And I wrote about my journey and my sort of transformation in my book, Word Pictures. And because it was sort of like I realized I was developing my aesthetic. Like we all have our ethics, we all have a metaphysic, but we also, philosophy also includes an aesthetic, and that's one greatly neglected area in theology. Most people think of it as an addendum, but I think our notion of beauty, that's what aesthetic is. Our understanding of beauty is actually necessary to understanding God, and if we don't understand that aspect of imagination and beauty, we're actually missing out on all God has for us. And so that transformation occurred, and that was roughly around the time where I was introduced to Michael Heiser's material. And Michael Heiser is a evangelical scholar, biblical scholar of ancient languages, and he had written an unpublished book called The Myth That Is True. Can't get it anymore. I used to get it online, but it's going to come out in published form in a couple months under a different title called The Unseen Realm. But I was reading that book, and that was right when I started researching for a script that I was writing, because during this time I had, always loved movies. Even though I was in graphic design, that was my day job, but I always loved movies and did it on the side. And then about 13 years ago, my first movie got made, which was To End All Wars. And that stars Kiefer Sutherland. And that was sort of my break into Hollywood, so to speak. And from then on, I've been a screenwriter, doing documentaries, feature films, and such. But I had a couple of tough years back, and it forced me to try to think of doing some other things, and one of those things was writing novels. And at the same time, I was writing a script about Noah, and I was so excited about it because I was finding out all this fascinating stuff, and that's how I stumbled upon Michael Heiser. And I had actually heard of Chuck Missler, some of what he says about the Nephilim in the past, but I never really got into it. But reading Michael Heiser's material sort of opened my eyes like Elisha's servant, and I saw the heavenly host in the scriptures in a way I hadn't before. And all of a sudden, this storyline, this sort of ancient Near Eastern storyline of God's divine counsel and the war of the seed of the serpent against the seed of Eve, it came alive in a way that I had not seen before. I'd seen pieces of it here and there in the Bible, but sometimes you can miss when you're looking for theological things, like looking at the Bible like it's a systematic theology, which it isn't, but we often look at it that way. You miss some of these underlying storylines, and that was what sort of inspired me to start writing the script on Noah. But then I heard, Darren Aronofsky was making a movie about Noah, and this was like 5 years ago. And I thought, that's it. I lost that fight. I wasn't, my movie wasn't going to get made. So I thought, well, how could I beat him to the punch though? How could I get it out there and say, well, mine was first, and that was writing it as a novel. And so I went ahead and did that that was like 4 years ago. And I wrote Noah Primeval, and that was the first novel of Chronicles of the Nephilim. But what happened was, in my research, completing that for Noah, that was where this storyline throughout the whole Bible opened up, and I realized, wow, this is going to be a series of novels, and that's what launched me on the series. What was the initial sort of explosion into it was studying what I had considered the most bizarre passage of the Bible had always been Genesis 6, 1 through 4 for me. And that was, where it says that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were attractive, and basically these divine beings called the sons of God come down to earth, they mate with women, and they have Nephilim, which are like hybrid angelic human beings that are giants, and that's what the word Nephilim means. And this was this weird passage that just stuck in there right before the flood, and it's connected to the evil that's going on, and I thought, that's weird, but there's a lot of weird things in the Bible that we don't always understand, so you just keep reading. And but understanding that is kind of a beginning of a storyline of giants that continues on throughout the text, and that was what sort of really got me excited. Was this is and then learning that this is a storyline that I think is not just this sort of arbitrary, there are giants every once in a while and they're bad guys and you kill them, but that they're actually there's actually a theological thread going on, and that theological thread goes back actually to the Garden of Eden in Genesis 3:15, where God is cursing the serpent, right? And he says, I will put enmity between your seed and her seed. There will be war between the seed of the serpent and the seed of Eve. And then it says, you will bite his heel and he will crush your head. And that most scholars explain that that's the first messianic promise, because the seed, of course, the seed of the woman, ultimately the seed of Abraham, is Christ, and in the New Testament it says Christ crushes the head of the serpent, etc. And so there's this war of the seed that's going on, and I think that these Nephilim, this is the other thing, what's the point? What's the point of these angels having sex with humans and having giants? I mean, what's the point? Well, I think that a further study of that, you find that there's something going on there. I won't go into all the details, but there's something going on there about God's created orders based on separation. He separates male from female, land from water, animals according to the kind. There's all this separation, and so I think that there's a violation of that holy separation between heaven and earth, between angels and humans, that's going on. And I think also these fallen sons of God are probably rebels from God who want to pollute the bloodline of humanity and stop the Christ, the Messiah, from coming, And I think there's something like that going on in there. And then that's the storyline that sort of launched the whole series. And then I thought, well, what stories am I going to tell? Because the Bible is so full of, and what do you focus on? And I thought, okay, I want to retell Bible stories, but I want to stay as true as I can to the text, but I want to add a little bit of imagination. And my premise became this. I said, okay, everywhere there's giants that show up in the Bible in some manner, those are the stories I'm going to tell. And I've already up to the 7th book, and there's going to be an 8th one, so it's kind of shocking to think there's that much on giants. Well, there kind of isn't. Look, I fill in a lot of in-between-the-lines stuff, so I add imagination, and there's more that I can explain, too, about that. But that was sort of, the genesis, and that's what sort of got it going and inspired it. But like I say, it's more than just bizarre mysteries in the Bible, but I do think that there's a theological thread, storyline that goes all the way to Christ, I think, actually. And so the other thing that I got inspired about, and this had been for many years, I thought, I would never want to, do novels about Bible characters, because number one, we already got the Bible, so why bother? And, we already know about Noah, what can you write, And then the other thing was I also had this sort of, like I said, I had these chains on my imagination because of my background and my tradition, and not necessarily. I don't mean that in a total derogatory way. I just mean, I believe the Bible is God's word. It's holy to me, and I think that and it's inspired, and so I wouldn't want to mess with it. In other words, so it made me a little fearful, and but I think I was freed from those shackles, and realizing as I studied the Bible how much God uses imagination interwoven within history. Yes, it's historical, but there's a lot of imagination that God uses, a lot of poetic imagery and such, and it sort of inspired me to do that as well. And so the example I like to give is Leviathan. I've got papers on Leviathan that I've written, and Leviathan is the sea monster that shows up in the Bible, and some Christians believe it's a dinosaur, and I don't. I think after studying it, I'm convinced that it's the same thing it is in all the other religions of the ancient Near East, because they also had Leviathan as well, and it's basically the sea dragon of chaos. And when you read certain passages like, for instance, let's see, Psalm 74, or let's see, what else is there? There's some other passages that I have there. But Psalm 74, basically, where it's talking about the, crossing the Red Sea and God establishing his covenant through Moses. And it says how it's talking about the Red Sea. And it says God crushes the heads of Leviathan. And that's plural, by the way, the heads, not singular head of Leviathan, the heads of Leviathan. And to study that, to realize, okay, there's a poetic thing going on there. He's talking about the Exodus and the establishment of his covenant, but he's also mixing into that sort of poetic language. And what that means is God pushes back the chaos of the world around us, and in order to establish his covenant order. And that's exactly what all the other religions did as well. They used the same imagery. It was a way of expressing their theology, right? And so if God does that, then you know what? I think I'm going to do a little bit of that too. So, for instance, I decided in the series to sort of push that a little bit, and I have a literal Leviathan, a sea dragon, showing up, but he's involved in very much of the chaotic elements that are going on. So that was my sort of inspiration for imagination, and yet trying to stay true to the Bible, because I also realize my audience is going to be mostly Christians who have a high regard for the Bible, so I certainly don't want to offend them in that sense. But I wanted to add imagination that would fill in between the lines and also address this storyline of the War of the Seed and the Nephilim and the Watchers and such. And that's kind of what became the series, which started out with Noah Primeval, goes to Enoch Primordial, which is like a prequel. So you see what happened, what it was like when Methuselah was a young man and the giants first came on the earth. And then it goes on to several of the other books, and it even goes into the time when Joshua enters the Promised Land and slays the giants. And right now the latest release is up to David. But in doing so, I was going to say something, but I forgot what it was. But anyway, so that's sort of like the thread that is driving it now. You know how it is when you get something in your head, this is good, and then you forget, and then you don't want to keep talking until you remember what it was you're going to say.
Yep. That it's going to be in the back of your brain. I had something good.
Maybe I should take a break from my yakking it if you have a question.
Well, it's so interesting, and I love your story, because I think that in a certain way, I kind of followed along those same lines, although my Christian walk has been, only a few years. But when I first became a Christian, I kind of bought into the whole thing that you had to be extremely fundamental in your beliefs. And so, I went there. I wanted to be the quote-unquote good Christian. I wanted to just, the phrase blind faith. And to me, from what people were telling me, that was what it meant. You just had to blindly believe, and if something didn't make sense to you, then you just had to accept it. And as time went on, I thought, there is so much evidence for what I believe, and there is so much scholarly work being done for what I believe. I don't believe my faith does have to be blind. I believe that my faith can be informed, and my faith can be reasonable, and my faith can be rational. And so, and I still very, very much believe that. And so but I found myself getting almost too much into my head and too cerebral about it. And then that kind of sometimes can separate you from relationship. And then I sort of evolved into this place where now I feel like I have a good balance of, the academic side of it, the apologetic side of it, but also embracing the mystery. You mentioned Francis Schaeffer, and I love to quote him when he says that the Christian is one whose imagination should fly beyond the stars. That is such a moving quote to me.
Amen.
Yes, and I see all of that being married in your work, and I see you and people like Dr. Heiser having this wonderful blend of really being passionate about as far as the scholarship and the apologetics side of your faith, because that's really important, and a lot of people are brought into faith through that realm. Not everyone has this, amazing moment of transcendence. Sometimes people need to be rationalized into it, and I think that's great. But there's this balance that I think people come to where they can embrace both sides, and I see that in your work, I see that in his work, and I think it's remarkable. I did want to tell you one thing, though. When I told my husband that I was going to be interviewing you, I was explaining to him who you were, and then I mentioned that you wrote the screenplay for To End All Wars, and I found out that there are 2 fans of Brian Godawa in this household. Apparently that's one of his favorite movies. I didn't know. So
that's great to hear.
Yeah. So what I'm really finding is, starting in, I'm going to pull some themes out of what you just said, but starting in Noah Primeval, one of the really remarkable things that you do, and I want to drill down on it a bit, is you imagine, what if these pagan gods that were worshipped in antiquity were not just the imaginations of like an unsophisticated people, but what if they were real entities, and what if these entities were actually fallen angels? And so, there's other scholars who have posited this could be a good way of looking at it, that these beings could almost be masquerading as gods in an effort to manipulate or control groups of people. I want you to talk about that and how that thread kind of develops through your books. It's really neat the way you write this.
Thanks. That's a great example of using imagination but tying it in theologically. So there's a sense in which I'm not sure where my imagination ends and the theological truth begins. Because yes, what I do in the book was, I thought, here was the sort of the premise was, I thought, I've always had a fascination with pagan gods because they all nations have their pantheon of gods and deities, whether it's ancient Sumer or Babylon or Canaan, and I just find that fascinating. And they usually would have a pantheon of gods, and sometimes even specific cities would have their own deity that they worship within the pantheon. And I thought, I'd love to tell a story where those beings are real, but how could that work? Well, as I studied the Bible, I also was led to when you look into this notion of the Nephilim, you're inevitably led to the book of First Enoch. And I've written actually a scholarly paper on the book of Enoch. It's at academia.edu for free if anyone wants to read it. Because I did research in the book of Enoch. And basically, the book of First Enoch, it's not scripture, and you don't have to believe it is, but the church has traditionally always had high regard for it, high respect for it. In fact, it was even considered scripture in the Eastern Church, in the Coptic Church. But nevertheless, this is a book that really, a portion of it focuses in on this days before the flood and goes into more detail about the giants and about Enoch himself during his time period. And it goes into more of those details. So one of the things I wanted to do was I wanted to draw from other sources, Jewish legends as well, integrate them in there. And because there are a lot of smarter people that have come up with more creative things than me in the past, and I thought it would be cool to integrate some of the other legends and stuff as long as it sort of fit with the Bible. But also I also am fascinated by ancient pagan religions, and I wanted to sort of explain, well, where did these religions come from? Like, why did they exist? You know what I mean? And part of that was like, what if there's some reality to the religion? And lo and behold, reading the Bible, I find there's several places where there's a hint that there might be a demonic reality behind false gods. For instance, in Deuteronomy 32, we read about Moses talks about the gods of Canaan, the Canaanites, and he says they sacrificed, this is Deuteronomy 32:17, they sacrificed to demons that were not gods, to gods they had never known, to new gods that had come recently. So, you're like, oh, so he's kind of saying that the gods are demons. And then David writes in Psalm 106, same thing. They sacrificed their sons and daughters of Canaan to the demons. It says they sacrificed to the idols of Canaan. So there's this notion, and of course, even in the New Testament, right? Paul's writing, and he says, look, in 1 Corinthians 10, what pagans sacrifice, they offer to demons, not to God. So there's this biblical notion that there's a supernatural reality behind these beings, and it's certainly demonic or spiritual. So I thought, okay, so then I'm reading First Enoch, and First Enoch is what goes into these sons of God and explains that these are the watchers who were rebelled from heaven, and it says that there were about 200 of them, and they came to earth, and then they set up, and then they were the ones that sort of instituted the giants and had sex with the women, all that kind of stuff. But it also talks about how they revealed occultic secrets and evils and sorceries to mankind, as well as war and weapons of war and all this stuff. And so I thought, wow, well, there's a connection going on here. What if these gods of the ancient world were really supernatural beings, but they weren't gods like they traditionally understood, but they were these fallen watchers masquerading as gods. And then, of course, as time goes on, they continue that deception into all these other pagan religions. And that was the premise that enabled me to then tell stories where I could also talk about these gods, like the gods of Sumer or the gods of Canaan, like the gods of Canaan, Baal, Asherah, Molech. These are all gods we read about in the Bible, but they're actual beings that have taken on these identities, and therefore they're demonic in that sense. And that was really, an exciting opportunity, because it wasn't just made up. It was kind of based on some hints in the scripture, and it certainly tells a spiritual truth. And that was the other aspect of this series, is Chronicles of the Nephilim is I guess you'd call it a spiritual warfare series, where it shows what's going on in the earthly side as, Joshua conquers the giants or what have you, but it also is showing what's going on with the demonic entities or the fallen watchers, how they are trying to take over and what's their goal and purpose. And even then, it's not entirely made up by me, because another element that I bring into the series that is really, I'm telling you, this stuff is wild, and I didn't ever want to face it before, because like I said, it's very supernatural, and I had more of an intellectualized faith, and I've had to become more supernatural in my viewpoint as I've studied for this stuff. But there's one other really fascinating thing that Michael Heiser brings out that it's not known because we don't think in these terms, and that is, in the ancient world, the Jews, as well as everybody else, believed that the heaven and the earth were united, and so whatever happened on earth happened in heaven, and vice versa. And so their temples, they believed, were actual mirrors or replicas of the real temple in heaven. Jews believe the same thing. They call it God's temple above the waters and all this. And so they have this connection, but that's not all. Because in Deuteronomy 32, there's this really interesting passage, and it's not only there's other references, but it's this notion that there are sort of territorial spirits or at least spiritual authorities over pagan nations. It talks about how God, during the time of Babel, when God separated mankind, it says that he separated mankind, and that, Genesis 10 says that there's 70 nations, so there's roughly 70. And he says that he places them under the authority of the sons of God. And I think these are the fallen rebels, fallen sons of God, because there are other passages that indicate that. But this notion is called allotment, and it's that God allots the pagan nations under the authority of these fallen rebels. But then he says, but the Lord's portion, his his portion is Jacob, his allotted heritage. And so, in other words, God's saying, I'm going to be the supernatural spiritual authority over Israel, but I'm going to give you guys want to worship false gods? You don't want to follow me? Fine. I'll put you under their authority, and you'll be ruled by these demonic entities. And so this is a concept that is not just in Deuteronomy 32. It goes on throughout the rest of the Bible. It shows up in little places, like, for instance, Daniel 7, right? Where we hear about the Prince of Persia, which is a supernatural entity over Persia, battling with the Prince of Greece and Michael over Israel. And so there's these references of these principalities and powers who are over the pagan nations. And this was something that I also applied to the story as well, which is that these pagan gods have been given this authority, so to speak, by God, and so they are trying to maintain their authority over their allotted territories, right? But then all of a sudden, when God comes into Canaan with his people and says, I'm going to displace you, you false gods, then they're not going to like that, so they fight back. And I try to bring a little bit of that into the storyline as well. So you've got these, like, all these different gods, and think about it. Bad guys may get along in terms of, they'll work together, right? But there's often problems with bad guys, and so if you put a bunch of evil guys who are jockeying for power together, you're going to have a lot of political backstabbing and betraying that goes on within the bad guys, and I have that going on within the sons of God as well. These fallen watchers, So I bring that into the story to give it some interest, and there's even some humor sometimes, But I wanted to. Another thing that I wanted to do was I wanted to capture the the true spiritual evil that I think the modern mind tends to, because of our relativism and such, and postmodernity, we tend to deny evil, the reality of evil. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, so who's to say? Blah blah blah. But I think that the world was so evil back then, and I wanted to depict that in this series in a very truthful way. And so I show, I deal with things like human sacrifice and pedophilia and necrophilia and homosexuality and all these things. I try to keep it, relatively circumspect. It's not real excessive, but there are some descriptions of sin that's going on in the world that God then judges. And, not just in the time before Noah, but in the time of Canaan, in the time of David, this stuff is always going on, and it's linked to these demonic entities. So my point here is that I believe that if you're going to tell a story, the power of the redemption of your story, and all stories offer some kind of redemption, whether it's Christian or not, the redemption that you're offering in your story is only as powerful as the accuracy with which you depict the sin that you're being redeemed from. So if you gloss over the sin or just sort of don't really deal with it because it's too gross or whatever, then when you offer your redemption, it's not going to be as believable. So I counterbalance this depravity that I depict in the stories, and that's in the Bible. I counter it with what I think, like a lot of Hollywood stuff, whether it's movies or even TV shows nowadays, they tend to specialize on the darkness and the depravity.
Right.
But I try to do the opposite. I try to have the depravity, but I try to show, like, for instance, I try to show the beauty of good marriages, whether it's Abraham and Sarah or, the redemption of Rahab. My favorite character in the whole series was Rahab, and what I do with Rahab, which has never been done before, but I think it's really, really cool. And so, excuse me. So I try to show the beauty of good marriages, of people trying to do the right thing, but every hero is flawed, whether it's Moses, Joshua, or David, or what have you. These are men who are sinners who did blow it, and I show that stuff as well. I show that stuff as well because the heart of it is that our God is bigger than our failings, and God is the one who's accomplishing his purposes, through imperfect men, and that's sort of the heart of the storyline, which allows me the freedom then to show people godly men messing up and finding redemption and such, and in the midst of this depraved world, and also to show a world that where God judges it and God cleans it out, but never fully. There's always some evil left, and it grows. And that's not to say that God is therefore incompetent or impotent. It's that God has a plan, and his final judgment is down the road. But in the meantime, he does do some judging, he does do some cleaning house, but we have to realize that evil will always be with us until it's finally wiped out, and that's being in the real world, and that's what I tried to do, was to sort of be in the real world while also being in a world full of imagination.
Well, I think it's certainly safe to say that Scripture itself is not squeamish, right? I mean, I think we could probably slap a rated R on the Bible in some cases.
Absolutely.
And, I think it's important not to shy away from those themes, because they do, as you say, the intensity of the evil only magnifies the superiority of the redemption. And that theme follows throughout what you have written. And what I want to ask you is something, when we talk about taking these themes from Scripture and injecting the imaginative aspects of it between the lines, the parts that maybe aren't specifically addressed in the Bible, but to flesh it out into a full-bodied story. And I know you've done so much research. There's such extensive appendices in all of your writing. Getting into what the customs of the time were like, what the traditions were, what the culture was, using all of that to sort of flesh out the ultimate story. But what would you say to people who are, I'll use the word squeamish, about elaborating or turning the story into more of a narrative and using some artistic license? There are people that are so stuck in this thing that you have to read every word as literally meaning what it says, and then not trying to expand upon that, where obviously the Bible was never, if the Bible was written to tell us every single detail about everything, it would be a thousands of volumes,
Yeah.
So,
you know what, Natalina, I actually took my cue from the Bible in how I wrote this series, and let me explain. I wrote a book called Myth Became Fact, and that you can also get that on Amazon. And what that was my biblical research into realizing that, believe it or not, folks, God himself in the Bible actually uses, in a manner of speaking, God uses a lot of the pagan imagination of the day, and he subverts it or redeems it and uses it for his own purpose. And one example I already gave of this was Leviathan, right? Where every other nation around Israel before Israel even existed had the belief of the sea dragon of chaos, and sometimes even called it Leviathan, right? But that's not all. When you read Deuteronomy and you read some of the Psalms, when God is bringing them into the promised land, now keep in mind they came from Egypt, right? And Egypt, where the life came from the river, came from the Nile, and it was a desert land. But now they're entering into this land where it comes from the rain, and life is the world is very different. And all of a sudden, God's using language of himself as if he's a storm god. In fact, if you look into some of the phrases used about God, like there are phrases that talk about how God is the rider on the clouds, right? And God thunders his mighty thunders. And yeah, these are metaphorical languages, but the language is exactly the same language that was used of Baal, the storm god in Canaan. Now, what am I saying? This is part of like facing some of the facts of the hard things of the Bible. You've got to be honest. And when you learn this stuff, you realize how much we are imposing our own bigotry and bias on the text if we don't understand the original background. Because when you look into it, you find out, basically what's going on there is these are people who understand the nature of storm gods, and that's how they see things. And God is coming to land saying, Baal isn't God, Yahweh's God. So one of the ways they do that, the authors do that, is by using this language of Baal about God. It's like saying, God is the one rider on the clouds, not Baal, because the Baal was known to be the rider on the clouds, right? And other things like that, storm language and stuff like that. And so there's a lot of polemics going on in the Bible that reflect this sort of attack on the other pagan gods. Mm-hmm. And this shows up in a lot of the names that we hear as well. I mean, you hear names like Jezebel. Jezebel's the infamous queen who brought in idol worship into Israel during the time of King Ahab in 2 Kings, right? Well, the actual her name in Canaan was actually Isabel. That's how they spelled it in Canaan, and it means where is the prince? And the prince was Baal, so Isabel. Well, guess what? The Jewish way of saying that is really a sort of a twist of the name, and Zebul means dung, and so in a way they changed it. It's the same name, but they changed it and twisted it to call it Jezebel, so it's like dung. They're making a play on words of her name. And so my point here, and there's lots of other places where that happens. And so what I'm saying here is that even the Bible uses imaginative sort of changes and alterations. I mean, look, and scholars, conservative scholars will tell you this, the book of First Chronicles is the same story of David that the book of Samuel is. But if you compare those two, you'll find out that Chronicles cuts out a whole bunch of stuff about King David, including his adultery with Bathsheba and many other negative things of David. And it's very clear that the writer of Chronicles is making a specific point about David and his, his righteousness before God by leaving out certain things in order to make that point. Now, if you're honest, you have to face that and admit that that's going on. There's an agenda behind Chronicles. Now, if you're liberal, you say, yeah, see, they're just lying. They're making it up, or they're twisting things to make their agenda. No, you don't have to conclude that. You can also just see it the other way, and that is, well, look, everyone, like the four Gospels, right? The four Gospels don't tell everything exactly the same either, because they're different perspectives and they're making different points. And so they're telling the same story that really happened, but they're giving different perspectives on it. And I think that's what happens with Chronicles. But my point here is that even the Bible itself uses integrates these pagan notions and redeems them by subverting them with different meaning. And then it also, my age is getting to me. So it's drawing from these pagan worlds, but it's also making certain points by what it leaves in or leaves out, because we all do that. And just because Chronicles leaves out some things to make a certain theological point doesn't make it false. It just means we can understand more clearly what they're trying to say. So I do that as well. I leave some things out. I have to telescope time sometimes, or move events around to make it work for what I'm doing. But I try to keep that to a minimal. And then there's a lot of things of, I think we have modern misinterpretations of things, we just, like I said, like the whole thing of the watchers and the allotment under the authorities, we don't see that. So we don't understand that whole aspect that's going on in the text. And so by bringing this stuff out and making it come alive in a novel form, I think it helps people to appreciate. But here's the other thing. Knowing that I was going to do this, I also realized, you know what? I respect the fact that people are going to read this, and some of them might go, this is too much, And so out of respect for my audience, I thought, well, what at the back of each book, I'll put an appendix. And I'll give some of my historical and biblical research that all my imagination is based on, so they can see, Brian's not just making this stuff up. It's kind of based in research, right? And then they'll appreciate it more and maybe have less fear of the imagination that's going on. And I did that in each of the books. But what's interesting is, that was one of the things I always used to love about Michael Crichton. He was one of my favorite novelists, and he would always, at the back of his book, he would have an appendix explaining some of the real science that his science fiction was based on. So I just think it's a great technique that people appreciate when they know what you put behind it, you know? Mm-hmm. And so each novel has that. And I think that helped. Some people have even, wrote me and said, I love the appendices as much as I do the novel. So then what I did was I took all the appendices out of all the novels, even the last novel that hasn't been written. I've written the appendix for that already, and I put them all into a separate book called When Giants Were Upon the Earth, and that is for those who just want to do the theology, and don't want to jump into the novels yet, Mm-hmm. And that's proven to be a real good seller, and people are loving that as well.
Well, I can tell, I think a lot of times my philosophy is you can tell a lot about the way a person reads by the way that they write. And I can tell that you read a book much like I do, where as you're reading it, you're sort of making mental notes about, I need to dig into that a little bit more. The author brings up an excellent point here. I'm going to, I find myself sometimes I have to have a Google open as I'm reading a book. And I don't know if that's incredibly nerdy or if that's incredibly common, but that's how I do it. So I can tell that that's the way you read. And so you respectfully do that for your writers so that they have the same ease of access to the information that you used to build your stories. And, I'm going to telescope in time a little bit here, because one of the things that I think is really cool about the Chronicles of the Nephilim, now granted, I would say that the best way to experience this series is to start from the beginning and work your way through. However, if you, let's say, for example, you are just a really big fan of the story of David, and you just want to read that book, you can read that book independently, and having not read the previous books, you're not out of the loop, so to speak.
No, I tried to write them so they could kind of stand alone.
Right.
But so if you really want to, if you really have to, you can enter in at any one of those novels, but be forewarned that you will appreciate so much more if you do read them in line with the series, because there's histories and stuff that I'll hint at, so you're not going to be introduced to a character and not know who the heck he is. But if you've lived the stories that happened before, it'll mean so much more, all the connections. But yeah, I did try to write them as standalones for people who love to just read their favorite Bible hero.
Right. And, you're right. There are these themes, whether it's the giants and, the War of the Seed, these themes that travel throughout the series. I want to talk about David Ascendant, and then we can go back and maybe, if we have time, talk about some of the other books. But I'm really excited because this book came out at the time of this recording today. It is available as of today.
Yep.
And the thing about this book is that it has you hooked from the very first moments of the book, where it talks about this glorious city. I won't give any spoilers, but technological advancement and beauty, and there's this destructive thing that happens that releases this ancient foe, and literally, as you describe it, all Hades breaks loose. So throughout the book, you describe these epic battles and just fearsome giants and spiritual forces bent on taking humanity down in this ancient struggle that forms a line throughout biblical history. And throughout your books, we get this up close and personal view of the sons of Rapha, and we see conversations between Moloch and Baal and Asherah, and then we meet David, who is obviously a man after God's own heart, but he's also clearly a man, a human, with all of the strife and brokenness that entails. He's as earthy as he is magnificent, and he meets up with all these epic characters, including this mysterious hybrid lion men of Moab. Talk to me about this book, because it's just, all of your books are so exciting, but this one's at the forefront of my mind right now, and it's just such an amazing, epic story.
Sure. Well, as a screenwriter, movies are a unique sort of art form. Each art form has its own sort of way of doing things, and novels are its own art form. And I come to the novel form as a screenwriter, so I tend to be more interested in action, revealing character through choices and action and moral dilemmas, not as much through maybe internal dialogue, monologues and stuff like that. And I need things to be paced and entertaining. I mean, entertainment is one of my highest priorities because I believe that I owe that to keep you wanting to turn the page. I owe that to you, the reader. Yes, I'm into meaning, significance, theology, and all that kind of stuff. But if it's not entertaining, it's no good. You know, the theology is worthless because people aren't going to read it. So that's how I come to the text. And so when I came to the story of David, you know, I'm like, well, what am I? You know, everybody knows David, and in fact, David and Goliath is boring to me because it's so cliche. And of course, I'm being a little bit facetious there, but you know, some people think Goliath is the only giant in the Bible. You know what I mean? But guess what? What was my original plan for the research? Okay, tell the stories where the giants appear. So that kind of helps me figure out if I'm going to tell David's story. I can't tell the whole thing because it's too much, and so where am I going to focus on my story? And guess what? Other than Goliath, there's there's a couple passages in 1 Chronicles 20, 1 Chronicles 11, 2 Samuel 21. And some of them are redundant passages, but nevertheless, there's these passages that refer to other giants. Not only that, but it names several of them. And you know, one of them is described as being 7.5 feet tall. Another one is described as having 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in number. And all of them are described as descendants of the giants. And they're almost all in the same passage. So 2 Samuel 21 starts like this. It says, and Ishbi-Benob, that's one of the giants, one of the descendants of the giants, whose spear weighed 300 shekels of bronze. I think that's like, I don't know, I think 8 pounds or something like that. That's heavy. Who was armed with a new sword, thought to kill David. But Abishai, one of David's mighty men, killed the Philistine. Then it says another war happened, and another giant named Saph was killed by another one of David's men. And then, so this goes through 5 different giants. 3 of them are named, and one of them is Lami, the brother of Goliath. So you've got a clear revenge theme going on with that guy, right? So, but there's several things going on in this passage. Number one, they're all spoken about in the same passage, and the context is that they were hunting David. Specifically, the giants were trying to kill David. Why? Well, this goes back to this seed of the serpent and the Nephilim, or at this point in the Bible, the giants are called the Rephaim. Now, in the Bible, if you study this, you'll find that there are many clans that are giant clans with different names, and some of them are the same. They're giants, but they're just given different names by different, countries or whatever. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So for instance, there are passages that talk about how there are the Emim were in the land, and they were as tall as the Anakim, and the Anakim were like as tall as the cedars, and the Anakim came from the Nephilim. So there's another tribe called the Zamzumim or the Zuzim, and these are all in the Bible. And then there's also the Rephaim, and the Rephaim is spoken about in Deuteronomy, where we hear about where Joshua's about to enter in the Promised Land, but he's in the Transjordan, and he has to wipe them out first. And the guy in the Transjordan who has to be taken care of is Og, the king of Bashan. And Bashan, it says he was the last of the Rephaim. And the Rephaim are giants. And it says that his bed was like 13 and a half feet long or something. So, it clearly talks about them being giants and being called people. So there are these different clans of giants, and guess what? These giants appear in Genesis 14 during the time of Abraham, too. So they're going throughout the text. By the time of David, don't forget, in the book of Joshua, I'm doing a little bit of backstory here, but it will be relevant. In the book of Joshua, chapter 11, we read that Joshua hunted down the Anakim. He comes in to conquer the Holy Land, and it says that he hunted down all the Anakim and wiped them out. He's deliberately going after the giants because these Nephilim are spoken of as, the Anakim in the land are spoken of as coming from the Nephilim, and the only other place where that word is used is Genesis 6. So the writer of the book is making a connection to those evil giants before the flood are connected to these Anakim in Canaan, and in Canaan they worship the serpent. So there's this sort of like theological theme going on here, that these giants are part of that corrupted seed that God wants to wipe out. But it says in Joshua 11 that Joshua wiped them all out in the hill country, etc., but except he left some in Gaza, Ashdod, and Gath. And guess what those cities are? They're on the coast, and they're the Philistines. Mm-hmm. So by the time, a couple hundred years later, by the time of David, there's the ones that Joshua left are now haunting David, and one of those is Goliath. He's from Gath, right? So it's important to understand then that there's something going on here, and God was saving the last of them for his Messiah, King David, right? He was the Messiah, the anointed one, out of which the son of David, the ultimate Messiah, Christ, will come. But nevertheless, David is that archetype or the type of what Christ will be. And so by the time of David, there's some of these giants still left in the land, and they're in the Philistine cities. And that's where Goliath comes from. And that's where these other giants come from. And then there's this huge battle in the Valley of the Rephaim. And the Valley of the Rephaim gets that name from the giants. By the time of David, the word Rephaim becomes sort of the generic, either they're the only giants left, the only clan of giants, or the word Rephaim becomes a generic term for giants in the land, so it's just, they're just called Rephaim by that time, see? And so Goliath was a Rephaim, and all these other ones were the son. Here's the interest. So here's the thing that kind of brings in the David thing. So in that passage, as I quoted, about the giants, in the time of David, it says they were descendants of the giants, but in Hebrew, that word is Yelid HaRapha, and Rapha is the Rephaim, so that's the giant, right? But there's a scholar who says that this terminology is not just saying that they descended from giants. It's actually the kind of phraseology you would use of a military cult. So in other words, they're devotees of some kind of military cult. And if they're all hunting David, I thought, well, then that sounds like there was an assassination squad, basically, and they're all dedicated to hunting down the Messiah or the seed of Abraham, right? So this is where that thing comes in. And so here's what I decide. I go, well, this is a story I want to tell then. I want to go into the lives of these giants and the world of the Philistines, something we haven't really seen before, and go back into their history and show a little bit about these giants and where they're coming from. And that's the tack I take. So we actually enter into the story learning about the giants and about the Philistines, but also there are good guy Philistines. For instance, Ittai the Gittite was a Philistine from Gath, the same city as Goliath, but he became loyal to David and was one of his most loyal warriors. So I also tell the story of him, how he converts to Israel and what that's like. And so I've got these 5 giants, including Goliath, the 6th, because I also have Goliath as a young man. And I tell their story, and then I counter that with the 5 warriors who fight them and kill them. I tell their stories on David's side of the mighty men. And so that's sort of the angle that I'm coming into the story. And then in terms of David's story, there's 3 things about David that I get from the text that I thought I wanted to really capture, and that was, 1, David was a man after God's own heart. He had a heart for God, a weakness for women, and a penchant for blood. So here's a man who really has a passionate desire for God, but he also brought in polygamy into the kingship of Israel, which was not a good thing. But I think he had a weakness for women that his son Solomon ended up taking to an extreme, right? Mm-hmm. And then also the Bible says, God says that I'm not going to let you build my temple, David, because you are a man of too much bloodshed. So here's a man who has faults. He's got flaws. He's got passionate desire for God, but also a passion for women, right? Mm-hmm. So I really relate to David, actually, because I feel like that in my own life, And even though I haven't committed adultery or murdered anyone, but I've done it in my heart, right? Mm-hmm. And I have that same sort of passion, ups and downs. And the bottom line is David messed up a lot. But God is the one who is holy, and he's the one who uses imperfect, sinful people like you and me, just like he used King David, who was supposed to be this, God's chosen one, but look at how messed up he could be as well. So that's the story I tell, and I try to bring in the romance that he has with his first wife, Michal, and Abigail. So I tell the romance there, and it starts out as good, but then, it sours over time. So I show that reality as well. At the same time, David's on the run from King Saul, who is possessed by an evil spirit. And I bring something into that story that is really a unique take on it that hasn't been done before, but I think it's consistent with the scriptures, and it's also consistent with the storyline of Chronicles of the Nephilim. And so David's being hunted by these giants, by King Saul, possessed by a demon, and meanwhile he has to become, he has to obey God, and ultimately he ends up becoming the king of Judah and Israel, and he wipes out the last of the giants in the Valley of the Rephaim. And that's sort of the storyline that I chose to focus on. So it ends before the David Bathsheba thing, because by that time he wiped out all the giants, and we don't really read about any more giants past that time period. So that's the story I tell in David Ascendant, and the people are going to recognize it who know the story of David, but they're going to see a lot of stuff they hadn't seen before, and they're going to go back, wait a minute, is that in the Bible? And they're going to be they're going to find out that, well, yeah, actually some of it is, Now, I do take a lot of creative license in giving these characters histories, because we only hear their names, we don't know anything about them. But I try to make it consistent with the text of what we do know, and make it all kind of fit together in a creative way. And so people who will go back and double check the Bible are actually going to be surprised and excited to see how much is actually really in there that they didn't see before.
And there's such a richness of detail, as I said, that you can really tell how much research that you put into this. One thing that I found really interesting is the way you highlight that, I'll say, like, from the stories that we learn in Sunday school, or sort of the stereotypical presentation of these people, you kind of get the impression that the Philistines were like these barbarians and thugs, and but really you highlight how actually they had this level of sophistication that in some ways may have actually been more so.
More cultured than Israel.
Right.
Oh, yeah, they're definitely more cosmopolitan, because think about it. They're on the coast. They're trading with all the other nations. They're adapting other gods as well as other technology. And meanwhile, Israel... and by the way, they're blacksmithing iron, and Israel doesn't have any of that, and they can't. And they're still with they still use stones and stuff. Yeah,
I think in the book you say they're stone scrapers or something like that.
Yeah. So in many ways, the Israelites. Yeah, we have this misnomer that Philistine means uncultured, but the truth is the opposite, actually. But nevertheless, that was sort of the irony of it, isn't it? Because of course, same thing with our culture. We have this modern, sophisticated culture that is, that so many people, particularly atheists and secular people, think we're so progressive and advanced beyond the barbaric days. But really, we are sophisticated barbarians, because, of course, we now are much more efficient at genocide and much more efficient at killing our offspring and sacrificing them to Molech, for our conveniences than they were back then. But now we're cleaner. And you know what I'm saying? So in a way, the barbarism lies in the evil behind the sophistication, and that's the real, deceptive nature of evil, isn't it?
And that's an excellent point. And we see even in David the way you just give him such a richness of character, and it goes back to what you were saying before about how if we don't focus on the maybe more earthy side of a man like David, then the goodness and the triumphant aspects of his accomplishments and his nature are diminished somewhat in a literary sense or in a narrative sense, because you're not getting the full picture.
Yeah, if I can say this, Natalina, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's been one of my personal journeys as an artist. I call it earthy spirituality. The Bible is earthy spirituality, and this whole Platonic sort of like holy, this notion of spirituality that many of us fall into, where it's just like, so heavenly minded, we're no earthly good, or just, it's just almost a negation sometimes of the physical world. But we forget that God's going to resurrect our bodies. It's going to be a new heavens and earth. It's not going to be floating around in a cloudy heaven, right?
Yeah.
God values the earth. God values the physicality of our existence, and there's a beauty to it. And this is why, and everyone always makes the Christians always make the complaints about the sex and violence, whether it's in movies or even novels, and it's, and it's like it's glorifying it, or, I mean, 50 Shades of Grey, right? All this erotic stuff. And you know what? I don't want to be pornographic at all, but I don't want to counter it with a negation of sexuality, right? Where you ignore it and you don't address it at all. It's just good people are just people who pray and, help the poor. And rather, I want to counter the evil sexuality with good sexuality and show that God, God loves marriage, and so the romance where Michal, first meets David and they fall in love because they're real young, right? But then later on, when he's a little older, he meets a more mature Abigail. But both of them have different, unique, beautiful romances that they bring into into the relationship. And look, that's what I had with my wife, man. I mean, I love my wife, man, and I love making love to her. And that's part of glorifying God. And I want to do that in these novels where it's not just showing how evil the world is. I want to counter it by showing good sexuality or good physicality and earthliness, and therefore also justice. Yes, you show the evil violence that the wicked people do, but there's good violence in the Bible, God's justice or judgment upon those people. So my goal is to counter the evil and depravity with the good earthy spirituality, and because that's what I've experienced in my life, And I'm so tired of you either have dysfunctional bad marriages for interesting drama, or none at all, because to most people it's like good marriages are boring. I don't think so. My marriage is a great marriage, and it's not boring. It's full of love and full of earthiness and sexuality, and it's just under the watch of God, right. and God is saturates everything we do, and that's what I want to promote.
That's really an amazing point, because I think that Christian authors have a tendency to go to these really almost, I guess to me it offends my sensibilities when it's like, evil is ghastly and ugly and gross, and then the good guy is pristine and untouchable. And to me, I just don't see where grace fits into that picture. Grace is such an important element here. And if we don't have this aspect of human beings doing what humans do, there's no place to fit grace into that whole theme, right?
Well, and isn't that the theme of the Bible? And right. Grace is the dominant motivating character redemption in all my biblical heroes, whether it's Noah, who starts out actually angry with God because he's tired of the evil and he just wants to be left alone and have his own little community in my Noah novel. But then God shows him he has a responsibility. Or whether it's Joshua who becomes so obsessed, he's called to wipe out the evil of the Holy Land, and so he's a man of violence, but it's just and righteous. But it takes him over, and he becomes consumed with it, so that he becomes vengeful, and he has to learn that there's a difference between justice and vengeance. And the same thing with David. David is a man who God anointed, and God, gave him that special status. And God gave him a passion that would give us, the most beautiful songs in the Bible, the Psalms, right? And that comes out of a passionate man. But he also made a lot of passionate sins and mistakes. In other words, the same passion that comes from a man who's very, very passionately, righteously loving his wife can also tempt him to go astray. And so you have to always be always have to be aware of your relationship with God and how it plays with your personal type. But but yeah, that's where the earthiness comes in.
Yeah, absolutely. So with what time that we have left, now that we have gotten an opportunity to talk about this latest book, we're going to go back in time a little bit, and I want to start, just to give the audience a little bit more of a well-rounded idea of what this series is. I want to start with Noah, Primeval, and I want you to just kind of give us a synopsis of how this story builds to where we are now with David, and then if you want to just put a cap on it by talking about where the story is going after David.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, it starts with Noah because I think that's a good entryway into the story, because I would think most people would be curious about Noah and the flood and stuff, and so basically I thought, what. If the world was as evil as the Genesis 6 says it was full of violence. Well, I think to survive in that culture, you probably would have to be a warrior. Since the Bible doesn't say what Noah was, we think of him as this white bearded man with with the happy little animals.
Right.
But it only said after the flood he became a man of the field. But that's when there's no one else around. And that's very common with military men as well. When they stop the war, they sit down and they, grow crops. But it doesn't say what he did before the flood. So I thought, well, what if he was a warrior? And what if he knew these false gods of the land, right? These gods of ancient Sumer, like we said, were the fallen watchers, but they were also masquerading as gods, and he refused to worship them while everyone else did. And his little clan didn't. And so the gods would hunt them down but Noah has a journey, because in his story is sort of like about holiness, and like he just is so disgusted with evil, he wants to be left alone, kind of like a lot of us middle Americans. We don't want to, we just leave us alone. We won't hurt you, don't hurt us, and we'll keep to ourselves. But what happens is when you have that mentality about wanting to break away from the world and have your own little cloistered community, evil will find you. It will come after you. You've got to stand up for righteousness, whatever society you're in. And it causes, there's a cost to it. And that's the journey that Noah has to go on. So by the time where he does embrace, building the ark and stuff, it's a wild journey.
Yeah.
And this is where you first get introduced to these gods and all these chimeric beings, these monsters that you see on the Babylonian and Assyrian architecture, where they're the lion body and a man's head. Well, I have those creatures actually alive in this story, because I thought, what if these watchers were engaged in this genetic chimeric experiments violating nature, right? Mm-hmm. So that's sort of the story of Noah, and that's his journey. And then I said, rather than moving forward, we need to jump back in time and before Noah, and show when the original fall of the Watchers came down from heaven to Mount Hermon. And Mount Hermon is in the Bible as being a spiritual mountain. But in the book of Enoch, it goes into a little bit more detail as the location where the Watchers first came down to earth. And actually, to this day, it does have that throughout history. Mount Hermon has had that sort of reputation for being a spiritual mountain, right? And so I go, well, let's go back in time and see when the Watchers first came down and first started mating, and how that came out. And Enoch, that was during the time of Enoch. And of course, we know Enoch was a holy man, right? The Bible doesn't tell us much about him. But I thought, what if, Enoch is a holy man. And in the book of First Enoch, it talks about how he goes to the Watchers and to the giants and proclaims judgment upon them, that God's going to bring the flood eventually, right? So I told that story, and I said, well, what if Enoch was originally called by God to do that, but he didn't want to do it at first, and he thought the calling was to be a giant killer rather than a giant preacher, right? So he becomes a giant killer, and he has a band of giant killers, and they're hunting down these giants, and then they stumble upon a plan of the evil Watchers that is just a diabolical plan. And Cain comes into this story because there's a legend, an ancient Jewish legend, that Cain was kind of a vampire. So I'll just leave it at that. And so I kind of play with that legend. And again, it's theological, not necessarily, I don't know that that's really happened. I'm just saying I use that as a theological thing. So this is a little bit more fantastical. And they have to stop the bad guys to do this amazing. When you discover what it is they're after, you'll go, oh, of course, that makes sense, and wow, that's going to be fascinating. But then as I move on down the series, I become a little bit more historical and a little bit less fantastical, but I still use some interesting legends and stuff. The third book is Gilgamesh Immortal. Now people say, well, Gilgamesh isn't a Bible hero. No, technically he isn't, but he actually is very connected to the Bible, and you have to read it to know. Yeah. But I always wanted to retell the story of Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the oldest hero story that we have in cuneiform texts, and I always wanted to retell it, but I found out that the things in his story fit into my storyline so perfectly that I was able to do that. And in the Epic of Gilgamesh, at the end, this is after the flood. Gilgamesh is one of the first kings of Uruk. And he's a mighty, guess what? He's a Nephilim. He's a giant. And that's how the legend goes. But at the end of the story, he goes to search for eternal life because he wants to be a god. And he hears that Noah survived the flood and that he heard that Noah's been given eternal life. So he goes to hunt down Noah in order to find out eternal life. Of course, what he finds out is not what he thought. And but that is a sort of an origin story, and I'll just leave it at that. That will fit in an amazing way as you read on. And then the next book that I write is Abraham Allegiant. So I jump a lot of years because there's no other giant stuff that's happening in the Bible. And so the next story is Abraham, and this is another one of those things where it's like we all think of Abraham as being this sort of pastoral shepherd, because he was a nomad. But guess what? In Genesis 14, talks about 5 kings of cities coming into the Canaan and wiping out a bunch of the giants. And then they capture Abraham's nephew Lot at Sodom and Gomorrah. And then Abraham takes a few hundred of his men and probably some other men and hunts down that army and rescues his nephew. So for him to be able to do that, I'm sorry, he's no simple shepherd. He was a warrior. So Abraham too was a warrior. But it talks about the giants in that time. And later on in the book of Joshua, we read that the Anakim that were in the land of Canaan during the time of Joshua, 400 years or so later than Abraham, right? But it says that they come from King Arba. So looking back in time, I figured out that King Arba was one of the originators of the Anakim giants, and that would place him roughly at the time of Abraham. And guess what? If you look at the Bible, it says Abraham lived a lot of his time in Canaan in the Oaks of Mamre, and Mamre is 2 miles away from Kiriath Arba, the city of King Arba. So I tell the story of his interaction with King Arba, who would give spawn to the giants of that land. And so there's a family feud going on there. But also I bring in Nimrod, because there's a Jewish legend that Nimrod was during the time of Abraham, and he had some interaction there. So I tell the story of the Tower of Babel and Nimrod and Abraham, and then I end with the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And the way that I integrate Sodom and Gomorrah will blow your mind. But I would argue it's actually theologically possible that this is what was going on. So I tell all that story, and there again, you've got the gods of the land, and there's still giants. Then I jump ahead another 400 years or so to the Promised Land, and I 2 novels together. It's sort of like book 1 and 2 is Joshua Valiant and Caleb Vigilant. That tells the story of Joshua and Caleb entering into the Promised Land, wiping out the giants, how they first had to kill Og of Bashan, then they had to get rid of the Anakim. And guess what? In the book of Joshua, 3 separate times there's given the names of 3 specific mighty giants, Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai. So they were so important that the Bible mentioned them 3 times, which means they must have been really hard to kill. And it says Caleb was the one who got rid of them. So I tell their story of those 3 giants as well as the wiping out of the giants. And then we end up with the David story. And like I said, biblically, we don't hear anything about giants after David. So in a way, David does the mopping up operation and finishes wiping out all the giants. And so you think, well, why would you have another novel called Jesus Triumphant? Well, yes, it's true. There are no mention of giants in the Gospels. But guess what? The Nephilim, when you read the Bible about evil spirits or demons, we all assume, oh yeah, fallen angels. But I don't think that that's true. The Bible doesn't say where evil spirits come from, and it doesn't say they're fallen angels because angels have actual physicality to their bodies. They can eat food. They have physicality. It's a different kind of physicality than ours, but it is physicality, whereas evil spirits are not. They're in search of a body. So there is an ancient tradition. The Bible doesn't say where they come from. It just, they're there. But in the book of 1 Enoch, it suggests that demons are the spirits of the dead Nephilim, because the Nephilim were special hybrid creatures, so that's why their spirits somehow survived on the earth. I don't know that that's entirely true, but it makes some sense and explains some things. So you can begin to see that Jesus and his story, all of a sudden he's the Messiah coming into the promised land, and what does he start doing? Casting out the demons, right? In order to purify the land for Messiah to come. And not only that, but there are some interesting references to Mount Hermon and to the gates of Hades and stuff, things that show up in the Gospels that are connected very much to the themes I've been developing. So I tell the story of how Christ will die and descend into hell, another tradition that, some Christians have believed and some have not, but I tell that story, and it's basically the story of Christus Victor, which is how Christ ultimately overpowers these gods of the nations, right? These principalities and powers, and he displaces all of them to become the Messiah. And then when he ascends to heaven, he's gonna, he ascends with his train of captives, right? The captives of the bad guys that he conquered, basically. So in a way, Christ is the ultimate victor over the principalities and powers, like Paul talked about, right? So that's going to be the last novel. It's going to be wild. It's going to be a wild ride. But if your listeners want to learn and read more about this stuff, you can find out I made a really cool website because I wanted it to be something really valuable. So chroniclesofthenephilim.com has artwork, book trailers, author videos, free articles, a lot of cool artwork and descriptions of what's going on if you want to learn more about it before you buy the novels. And you can buy them all at Amazon, but chroniclesofthenephilim.com is a really cool site where I also have a bunch of free articles of scholarship that I used in my research as well. So there's a lot of prizes and surprises if you go there.
Well, and the website I have found is something that you, even if you don't have the books at your fingertips, you're going to want to, because this website itself is going to pull you into this rabbit trail. So fair warning, when you go to the website, you're not going to leave it for a while. That's what I found anyway. I just kept coming, you've got the different videos and the different explanations of what each book entails, and you've got, links to all of this different information. It's fantastic. And as you were explaining each book, I just found myself smiling the whole time, because it really is such a remarkable way to put out these amazing stories. I did an interview once. I was the guest on someone else's show, and I was talking about biblical stories, and I used the word stories, and I received a fair amount of hate mail because people hated that I used the word story, because to them that it conveyed fiction, and that's not obviously what I meant at all. I mean, it's the greatest story ever told, right?
Yes.
And so I find that there's this comparison with your work to things like Lord of the Rings and the Chronicles of Narnia, and I think it's an apt comparison, because there is so much epic scope involved, and yet at the end of the day, it is something that is redemptive, and I think it is only appropriate that you're going to be taking the series to Jesus Triumphant, and I would recommend that everyone get their hands on these books. If possible, go from Noah and all the way through to where we are now at David. It just so fantastic. I'm really, really excited that you took this on, Brian, and I think that it was a task tailor-made for you, given your various talents and your skill set. And one thing I want to thank you for, too, is that you have made audiobooks available. And, you know, gosh, I wish more authors would do that because, you know, personally, I would prefer to read if I am able. However, sometimes there just isn't the time. Sometimes we are forced to multitask, and you yourself are reading the books in these audiobooks, and you do such a good job. Maybe that's why a lot of people don't do it, is because they don't have the reading, you know what I mean? Some people can write amazingly, but they can't read it in a compelling way, if that makes sense. And you are a storyteller in various mediums. So this is something that I'm also very, very excited about. I'll put links in the show notes to all of the different ways that people can access your work, but I want to finish on one point, and that is this, and this is a little bit of a 180, but you know, the word Nephilim is involved in all of your writing and the concept of these giants, but I don't want people to mistake this for any sort of speculative, how do I want to word it? It's not something that involves future Nephilim situations or any of these sort of fringe theories. It's very, very historically grounded in what the Bible contains. Is that fair to say? Do you kind of know what I'm driving at?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because you know, your listeners are, I'm sure, are familiar with. There's a lot of interest nowadays in the Nephilim and the Watchers and the end times, and people are really pursuing that together. And I'm not in that camp where I think there's some kind of end time scenario with Nephilim and stuff necessarily. I don't, but I wanted to be true to what happened in the past. And the other side of the coin is sometimes in our naturalistic biases where we don't want to face the fact that you know, there could be some wild things in the past that did happen, because it was a different world back then. So for example, you know, there's a lot of people out there in the whole Nephilim world, and they're saying that there could be giants like 15, 20, and 30 feet tall. I don't think there's any evidence for that. Mostly I think they're probably 7 to 8 feet tall. And in fact, even there's even scholarship that indicates that Goliath may not have been 9 feet 9 inches. It may have been more like what is it, like 7 feet tall or something like that. But my point there is just that it would be absurd, actually, I think, to have giants, you know, 30 feet tall and stuff like that. I don't think that's even physically possible. But just because it says giant in the text doesn't mean it's anything, you know, because the Israelites were about 5'5" in that time period. So really, someone 7 feet tall really could be considered a giant, because that's really a lot taller. And so now I push it a little bit, and I do have a couple of giants that show up that are 15 feet tall, but that's the tallest. You know, most of them around 8 feet or something like that. So because I'm doing fiction, I sometimes, you know, do a little creative license there. But yeah, there's a lot of speculation now going on, and it's just sort of like I think it's consuming people's time and drawing away from the gospel, to be quite frankly. To be quite frank, I think that you know, we need to be pointing people towards Christ, and that's what this storyline does. Is it points you towards Messiah, because that's what it's all ultimately about, Messiah.
That's great. Thank you so much, Brian, for coming on the show. I'm really excited to get back into the stuff of yours that I haven't read yet. And, I want everyone to know that outside of this wonderful series, you write on so many other topics, including, Hollywood worldviews, things along those lines, a world that you're quite familiar with. And we're going to have you back on in the very near future, if you're up for it, to talk about that aspect of your research and your scholarship. Are you excited to do that? Because we can do that.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, when the Noah movie came out, there was a big controversy, and I was kind of at the center of it because I put a critique out about the Noah script before anyone else did, because I got a hold of an early script, and I criticized it as being Noah was an environmentalist wacko, and so when they were looking for, somehow they found me on the web. Let's put it that way. I'm not anybody important, but somehow they found me, and I went viral, and so I kind of got involved in that controversy of the movie. And the new Moses movie is coming out, and there's some red flags coming up. So that comes out December 12th. So it's maybe sometime after that we can talk about stuff like that. I'd be glad to. Absolutely.
Yeah, we'll do that for sure. So until then, I want to have everybody go to your website, find all the links in the show notes. And Brian, thank you so much for coming on Beyond Extraordinary today.
Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to Beyond Extraordinary with Natalina. For the latest headlines and program schedule, please visit extraordinaryintelligence.com.